The conversation about the modern British crown is no longer confined to balcony moments, glittering receptions, and carefully wordsmithed court circular entries. Increasingly, it revolves around how senior royals translate soft power into tangible good at home and abroad, how they frame the United Kingdom's place within a fractious world, and how they can remain culturally resonant without crossing the red line of political partisanship. In that context, the past few weeks at Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace have offered a revealing snapshot of a dynasty consciously recalibrating its public voice. The picture that emerges is of a father and monarch who is intent on embedding a legacy of inclusion and humanitarian outreach, and of a son, his constitutional understudy, who appears determined to steer that legacy into arenas deemed too sensitive for royal comment only a generation ago. A monarch determined to act, even in convalescence. Sources close to the court stress that King Charles III's diary is curated, not curtailed. The sovereign still builds his treatment sessions around weekly audiences with the Prime Minister, Privy Council meetings, and a stream of engagements that underscore his personal crusades. Aides point out that every time Charles steps out, whether to reopen a cathedral roof in Yorkshire, or convene faith leaders at Lambeth Palace, he is careful to weave a note about shared humanity into his remarks. Palace speak calls it the unbroken thread of his reign, a guiding principle that Britain's diverse communities and the wider Commonwealth must recognise themselves in the institution that ultimately crowns their head of state. It is why last year's coronation, for all its Plantagenet pomp, included the Hindu Saragama chant, the Jewish Psalm 122, and an imam's intonation of Bismillah. That philosophy surfaced again when the king welcomed a carefully selected cohort of refugee professionals to the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace. Far from limiting the meeting to a handshake and a photograph, Charles arranged for each participant to be budded with a senior member of the royal household for a shadowing placement. A Syrian architect will observe conservation work at the royal collection, a Sudanese pediatrician will spend time with the palace's medical officer, an NHS liaison team, an Afghan IT specialist is set to help the digital unit catalogue several thousand pages of Georgian-era correspondence. Courtiers say the idea sprang from the king's own margins on briefing papers. Give them a seat at the table, not merely a tour. As one equerry put it, he wants them to feel ownership of the building whose facade they've only ever seen in newspaper photographs. The King's Trust, the rebranded charity he founded in 1976, when he was still the 27-year-old Prince of Wales, provides the formal framework. Quietly, the trust has funneled bursaries, English language tuition, and apprenticeship grants to more than 300 displaced professionals from Ukraine, Syria, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan since 2022. In boardroom presentations, the charity calls it skills salvage, rescuing talent that might otherwise languish. Insiders confirm that Charles has asked for quarterly metrics on how many of those placements convert into permanent employment inside UK institutions. For him, the numbers matter, because they underpin the monarchy's claim that it is not merely ceremonial, but catalytic. Prince William's deliberate foray into contested territory. While his father refines that domestic mission, the Prince of Wales has begun to test how far royal soft power can travel beyond British shores. The meeting in Kensington Palace's White Drawing Room with representatives of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society was not publicized in advance, and, tellingly, included no photographers. William wanted candor, not a photo call. Participants later described a 90-minute conversation, in which the heir asked granular questions about the logistics of moving intravenous fluids across checkpoint bottlenecks, the shortage of dialysis consumables, and the trauma protocols for paramedics attending scenes of multiple casualty airstrikes. One delegate, a field surgeon from Khan Yunis, told the Times that the prince's detailed grasp would shame many politicians. The context is crucial. In February, during a visit to the British Red Cross headquarters, William issued what veteran royal correspondents labelled the most explicit conflict-related statement since the Queen's 1956 Suez remarks. With cameras rolling, he urged sustained humanitarian corridors for aid into Gaza and emphasized the moral imperative to free hostages. Buckingham Palace, conscious of precedent, noted that every syllable had been considered in consultation with government. Even so, diplomats privately marveled, no working Windsor had invoked Gaza by name in decades. This month's follow-up meeting therefore feels like phase 2 of a carefully open-ended strategy. Rather than retreating after the initial ripple of headlines, William is doubling down, seeking direct testimony from medics on the ground. Aides insist the prince has zero intention of offering a geopolitical blueprint. What he will do, they say, is amplify the humanitarian signal and prod donor fatigue. If his popularity nudges philanthropists to underwrite an extra field clinic, the palace views that as a legitimate, politically neutral achievement. Yet neutrality is in the eye of the beholder. Some pro-Israeli commentators regard any engagement with Palestinian NGOs as giving tacit legitimacy to the Palestinian Authority's diplomatic agenda. Pro-Palestinian activists, conversely, fear that a royal imprimatur might be cited by Westminster to offset criticism of arms sales. That divergent reaction highlights the risk William is prepared to shoulder, and implicitly signals that his future kingship may inhabit a more conversational space than that of his forebears. One former private secretary summarizes it this way: he is evolving the doctrine from never comment on controversy to comment only when the human cost is incontestable. The unseen choreography between father and son. Observers detect a pattern. Charles pushes inclusivity at home, William spotlights humanitarian urgency abroad. Both initiatives dovetail under the broad rubric of compassionate modernization. Palace sources deny any formal script, yet concede that the King and the Prince of Wales speak by secure phone most Sunday evenings, sifting upcoming engagements for thematic overlap. The King wants to ensure that his son's interventions never blindside Number 10, or the Foreign Office, says a Whitehall liaison officer. Equally, William is acutely aware of his father's desire to embed a legacy of tangible humanitarian work, not just ribbon-cutting. To that end, a new joint working group, nicknamed internally the Nexus Unit, has been formed, drawing staff from the King's Trust, the Earthshot Prize Secretariat, and the Household's Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office Desk. Its mandate: identify global flashpoints where royal convening power could speed up aid delivery, destigmatize refugees, or highlight climate resilience. Early scoping papers list Sudan's displaced micro-entrepreneurs, Guyana's coastal erosion crisis, and pediatric oncology supply chains in Ukraine. Each dossier bears the discrete cipher, CW Charles William, signaling co-ownership. Tradition versus timeliness. None of this heralds an abrupt abandonment of monarchical reserve. Advisers emphasize that the royals will not become shadow foreign ministers in plumed hats. But the incremental shift matters. For decades, the family's public interventions on conflict were limited to private audiences with peace negotiators, or donations to the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, explicit pleas for humanitarian access are being spoken aloud, first by the King at Windsor Castle, when he met Ukrainian President Zelensky, and now by the Prince in the Gaza context. Within court circles a debate simmers. Some elders warn that stepping too near geopolitical minefields courts reputational blowback. If William comments on Gaza, will he also comment on Nagorno-Karabakh, on Tigray, on Myanmar? Younger courtiers counter that selective engagement is inevitable given Britain's limited leverage, and that ignoring the world's most televised humanitarian crisis would itself constitute a political statement. Lord Janvrin, the late Queen's former private secretary, once quipped that the sovereign's art lay in doing nothing so expertly that it looked like leadership. William, by contrast, seems to believe that doing something, albeit within carefully fenced parameters, can project relevance without shredding impartiality. A public ready for recalibration. Polling suggests the gamble enjoys broad, if cautious, support. A recent Ipsos survey asked Britons whether the royal family should shine a light on humanitarian crises, even where conflicts are politically contentious. 59% agreed, 21% opposed, the rest were unsure. Among 18 to 34-year-olds, agreement climbed to 68%. Analysts interpret this as latent permission for the royals to echo, in measured ways, the moral activism that younger generations expect from public figures. Crucially, no politician can accuse William of freelancing on partisan policy, while his focus remains squarely on the alleviation of human suffering. By foregrounding Red Crescent ambulance shortages rather than ceasefire clauses, he walks a line Downing Street can endorse without ceding diplomatic prerogative. The Foreign Secretary's office privately noted that William's February statement aligned precisely with the UK's humanitarian aid push at the UN, useful amplification, without added complications. Looking ahead. What might the next 12 months bring? Courtiers hint that the heir could host a silent auction dinner at Kensington Palace benefiting medical evacuations for children wounded in conflict. A pilot program to place refugee midwives in NHS maternity wards is also under review. Meanwhile, the King, assuming health allows, plans to convene an interfaith summit on refugee integration at St James's Palace before Christmas, mirroring an event he staged as Prince of Wales in 2015. Should these initiatives proceed, historians may someday mark them as the embryonic phase of a reign, eventually two reigns, that reimagined royal neutrality not as disengagement, but as non-partisan humanitarianism. It is a nuanced recalibration, staying politically colorless while refusing to remain morally mute. Whether that model will satisfy critics on all sides is another question. Yet the attempt itself signals an institution neither paralyzed by precedent nor heedless of it, an institution searching, under the twin guidance of a convalescent king and an increasingly confident prince, for a voice equal to the urgencies of the 21st century. And so, as the gilded gates close each evening and the palace lights glow behind mullioned windows, one can imagine two men, father and son, seated at opposite ends of the quadrangle, reading the same intelligence cables, annotating them with the same urgent margin note. How do we help?